The afternoon sun bore down on the quiet urban street, its glare reflecting off the windshields of parked cars. Officer Daniel Hayes adjusted the brim of his patrol cap and leaned back in his seat, idly scanning the lanes for any sign of trouble. On the surface, it was a routine patrol, another slow day in the precinct, but Hayes thrived on the sense of control it gave him. He had been on the force for over a decade, and in his mind, the uniform was more than clothing. It was authority personified. Every car that passed was a test of obedience, every driver a potential challenge to his perceived dominance. From the corner of his eye, Hayes noticed a black sedan slowly cruising through the intersection. The driver's calm posture caught his attention, not the nervous, shifting, or erratic movements he often associated with suspicious behavior. Something about the man's composure irked him. With a flick of the wrist, Hayes activated the patrol lights, the blue and red beams reflecting sharply against the city's concrete walls. The sedan eased to the side of the street without protest. The driver, a black man in his early 40s, sat upright, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. His expression was calm, measured nothing like the jittery faces Hayes had encountered countless times before. He opened his window slowly, meeting Hayes's gaze with quiet confidence. "Good afternoon, officer," he said evenly. Hayes felt a flash of irritation. Politeness did not intimidate him. If anything, it fueled his sense of superiority. "Afternoon," he replied curtly. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The man shook his head subtly, maintaining his composure. Hayes's jaw tightened. He wanted compliance, fear, or at least the hint of guilt, but all he got was calm, controlled poise. As Hayes began citing minor infractions, a broken taillight, an expired registration, he noted the man's lack of defensiveness. There was no stammering, no sudden gestures, just a steady, observant demeanor. The officer's frustration began to bubble under the surface. He had expected resistance, but instead he encountered composure, and that composure felt like a challenge. Every word Hayes spoke carried a subtle threat. Every motion hinted at the power he assumed he wielded. The man listened quietly, answering only when necessary, and always with precision. Hayes' mind raced. Who was this person who did not flinch, who did not overreact, who seemed fully aware yet unafraid? The street around them felt smaller, the sun hotter, and Hayes more exposed than he wanted to admit. It was a routine stop, yes, but in that brief exchange, the dynamic was shifting unbeknownst to Hayes. The calm man before him was more than he appeared. As Hayes reached for his notepad, preparing to escalate, a tension hung in the air, one that hinted at confrontation, but also at something hidden beneath the surface. The calmness of the man, his deliberate movements and unwavering eye contact, was the first subtle indication that this stop would not unfold like any other. What began as an ordinary traffic check was about to evolve into a test of power, control, and the unpredictable consequences of underestimating the wrong person. The tension between Officer Hayes and the man in the black sedan had only thickened as the sun edged lower in the sky. Hayes shifted in his seat, glaring at the calm driver who remained composed, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, eyes steady and unflinching. Every question Hayes asked was met with precise, unhurried answers. Answers that, instead of appeasing him, seemed to irritate him further. The officer had expected resistance, nervousness, perhaps even an apology for minor infractions. Instead, he encountered a silent assertion of control, subtle yet unmistakable. "You realize your registration is expired, right?" Hayes barked, tapping his notepad. The man nodded once, softly. "Yes, officer. I was planning to renew it this week. No hesitation, no excuses." Hayes' jaw clenched. This calm, measured demeanor was not submission. It was defiance in its quietest, most frustrating form. His authority felt challenged, his uniformed power seeming almost invisible in the face of composure. Hayes stepped out of the vehicle, his boots clicking on the asphalt, his hand brushing against his holster. He leaned toward the window, lowering his voice in what he believed was an intimidating tone. "I need you to step out of the car." The man did not flinch. "Am I being detained, officer?" he asked evenly. Hayes' irritation boiled over. "I said step out. Now." The civilian complied, moving deliberately, not hastily. His movements were controlled, precise, calculated, to convey neither fear nor aggression. Hayes noticed the man's calm, but he interpreted it as arrogance, as if the driver were mocking him silently. A small crowd had begun to gather along the sidewalk, drawn by the flashing lights and tense posture of the officer. Whispers of curiosity spread as bystanders glanced nervously at the unfolding scene. Hayes could feel his pulse rising. He was used to controlling these interactions with little effort, but here was a man who remained unshaken, silently observing every movement. Verbal intimidation was next. Hayes leaned closer. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" The man's reply was simple, quiet, yet deliberate. "Yes, officer. I understand the situation." No fear, no apology, just awareness. A spark of frustration flashed in Hayes's eyes. He wanted reaction, acknowledgement of his authority, something to justify the rising aggression he felt within himself. Instead, he encountered only measured compliance and unshakable poise. Hayes's thoughts raced, strategies forming, each more aggressive than the last. He had crossed the line of routine traffic stop etiquette. He knew it, yet he convinced himself the man needed to be taught a lesson in respect. As the officer's tone sharpened and his gestures became more forceful, the bystanders recoiled slightly, sensing the imbalance of power, the potential for escalation. Hayes's overconfidence was a mask for impatience, a desire to assert dominance. The man's calmness, his deliberate, controlled actions hinted at something beneath the surface, a subtle tension that Hayes could not yet understand. What began as minor harassment was rapidly evolving into a confrontation whose consequences neither of them could fully anticipate. The line had been crossed. Authority, calmness, and hidden strength were colliding on a sunlit street, with the outcome hanging precariously in the balance. Each second stretched longer than the last, a quiet storm brewing before the inevitable explosion. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the quiet street, but the tension between Officer Hayes and the man in the black sedan remained as sharp as ever. Hayes's patience had worn thin. Every calm response, every measured movement from the driver seemed to mock him silently, challenging the authority he so desperately needed to assert. He clenched his fists, feeling the heat of frustration rise in his chest. The routine stop had become anything but routine. It had become a personal battle, a test of control that he refused to lose. "You're wasting my time," Hayes snapped, stepping closer. His voice carried the edge of irritation that had been simmering for minutes. "Step aside. Let me check your vehicle properly." The driver complied without hesitation, his movements deliberate, almost slow, but precise enough to convey absolute composure. Hayes noticed the calm gaze that met his, steady and unflinching, and something about it ignited an anger he could barely contain. This was no ordinary driver. Frustrated by the lack of fear, Hayes made his move. A shove to the man's shoulder, intended as an assertion of dominance, was met with silence. The civilian's posture remained unbroken, his balance perfect. Hayes' pulse raced. The crowd along the sidewalk had grown slightly, whispers rippling as they witnessed the officer's aggressive tactics. "I said, step out of the way," Hayes barked, raising his hand to gesture the man toward the curb. The driver's calmness became almost infuriating. He spoke in a quiet, measured tone. "Officer, I'm complying. Please don't escalate this further." His words were precise, authoritative in a way that contrasted sharply with Hayes's volatile energy. "Hayes, blinded by frustration and pride, ignored the warning. His next movement was deliberate, a push against the man's chest intended to assert control physically. The man staggered slightly but did not react aggressively, instead regaining his stance with perfect poise. Hayes's anger boiled over. He reached for the driver's arm to cuff him, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of frustration. The driver allowed the motion without resistance, his face calm, betraying no hint of panic. Each step Hayes took to assert dominance only highlighted the civilian's discipline and composure. This quiet strength unnerved him more than fear ever could. The bystanders whispered nervously, some reaching for their phones, recording the scene. The atmosphere thickened. What began as a traffic stop had transformed into a tense confrontation. Hayes' every action, every gesture, was now scrutinized by witnesses, each one silently noting the imbalance of power. The officer's authority, once absolute in his mind, was fragile here, exposed by the calm resilience of the man before him. As Hayes continued to escalate, his voice louder, movements sharper, he failed to notice the subtle ways the civilian had begun documenting the interaction. What seemed like a compliant target was anything but passive. The first strike had been delivered, but the real storm was only beginning, and neither Hayes nor the onlookers yet understood the full scope of what they were witnessing. The tension on the street had reached a palpable edge. Officer Hayes' frustration radiated in sharp movements and clipped words, while the man in the black sedan remained calm, his posture steady and deliberate. He had allowed the officer to assert his authority, to escalate physically, but every step Hayes took was quietly being documented. From a subtle hand in his pocket, the civilian activated a small, discreet device, nothing flashy, nothing overt, but enough to capture the unfolding encounter in meticulous detail. Every shove, every threat, every aggressive word would be preserved, ready for the moment justice needed to be served. Hayes, blinded by his own ego, didn't notice the slight movements of the man's hands. He leaned in closer, voice rising. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" The words came sharp, like a whip cracking against the calm air. The driver's response was measured. "I understand, officer. I'm complying, as I said." His eyes never wavered, and there was a clarity in his gaze, an awareness that made Hayes' anger burn hotter. The officer could feel that subtle challenge, the silent refusal to be intimidated, but he dismissed it as arrogance. A small group of bystanders had gathered, drawn in by the flashing patrol lights and the escalating confrontation. Some whispered, others quietly recorded with their phones. The officer's aggression, once private, was now public, and the man's composure only highlighted Hayes' erratic behavior. The camera hidden in the driver's pocket ensured that the officer's actions would be undeniable. Every shove, every threat, every aggressive step would exist as evidence beyond dispute. Hayes reached for the man's arm, intent on handcuffing him without cause, and the civilian allowed it, still calm, still controlled, but the hidden camera captured each movement. The officer's overconfidence blinded him to the fact that this was no ordinary citizen he was confronting. The man's silence, his perfect composure, was a weapon more potent than any argument. Hayes' attempts at intimidation only emphasized his own loss of control, each aggressive action caught in real time. The street, once ordinary, had become a stage. Every passerby was a silent witness, every whisper another mark against the officer. Hayes' hubris was on display, and the civilian's hidden strategy ensured it would not go unnoticed or unpunished. The quiet hum of the device in the driver's pocket was almost imperceptible, but it represented power, a counterbalance to the officer's unchecked authority. As Hayes continued, the tension thickened, the crowd's unease growing. The civilian's careful, controlled actions contrasted sharply with the officer's erratic aggression. It was a clash of two kinds of power, raw authority versus quiet, calculated control. In this moment, the street was no longer just a routine stop. It was the first act in a confrontation that would ultimately expose the truth and redefine the balance of power. Hayes had delivered his first strike, but the real story, the one that would unravel his overconfidence, was quietly being recorded, frame by frame, in perfect clarity. The flashing lights continued to pulse against the storefront windows, turning the quiet street into a scene of spectacle. Officer Hayes' patience had completely eroded. What had started as irritation was now something deeper, an urgent need to reassert dominance. The man's calm compliance, his steady tone, and unwavering posture felt like a silent rebellion. Hayes convinced himself that the only way to regain control was to escalate officially. "That's it," Hayes muttered sharply. "You're under arrest." The words hung in the air, heavy and abrupt. A murmur rippled through the small crowd of bystanders. The charge, however, was vague, resisting investigation, and failure to comply, despite the man's obvious cooperation. Hayes barely attempted to justify it. In his mind, the authority of the badge was explanation enough. The man did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he turned slightly, placing his hands behind his back with deliberate calm. "I am not resisting, officer," he said evenly. "I am complying fully." That composure only deepened Hayes's frustration. He stepped forward and secured the handcuffs tightly, perhaps tighter than necessary. The metallic click echoed sharply, a sound meant to symbolize control. But as Hayes fastened the cuffs, he noticed something unsettling. The man's breathing remained steady. No panic, no visible anger, just awareness. Hayes guided him toward the patrol car with a firm grip on his arm. "You think you're smarter than me," he muttered under his breath. The man gave no response. His silence felt intentional, strategic. It was as if he understood something Hayes did not. The crowd watched closely now, several phones raised. A woman from across the street called out, "He wasn't doing anything." Hayes shot her a glare, daring anyone to challenge him further. For a brief second, doubt flickered in his mind. Too many witnesses, too many eyes. But pride quickly smothered hesitation. He opened the back door of the cruiser and guided the man inside. As the door shut with a hollow thud, Hayes stepped back, exhaling sharply. The arrest was meant to end the confrontation, to re-establish his authority. Instead, it felt strangely incomplete. The man inside the patrol car sat upright, hands cuffed, gaze forward. He looked less like a suspect, and more like someone observing a process he had already calculated. Hayes walked around to the driver's seat, radioing in the arrest with clipped, confident phrases. He framed the narrative, carefully describing non-compliance, suspicious behavior, and escalating tension. Each word was chosen to justify his actions. On paper, it would sound procedural, routine, but as he pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the murmuring crowd and flashing reflections in the windows, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. The man in the back seat was too calm, too controlled. There was no anger, no desperate attempt to plead innocence, just silence. In the rearview mirror, Hayes caught a glimpse of the man's eyes. They were focused, observant, not defeated. For the first time since the stop began, a subtle doubt crept into Hayes' confidence. He pushed it aside. An arrest was an arrest. Paperwork would follow. The system would support him. Yet, as the patrol car drove toward the station, the balance of power felt less certain than it had minutes before. Hayes believed he had won the confrontation. He didn't realize he had just walked straight into something far bigger than a routine arrest. The patrol car rolled into the station parking lot just as the last traces of sunlight faded from the sky. The building stood solid and unremarkable, its brick exterior carrying the weight of routine authority. Officer Hayes stepped out first, straightening his uniform before opening the rear door. The man inside remained composed, shifting forward only when instructed. "Out," Hayes ordered. The man complied without hesitation. Even in handcuffs, his posture was upright, controlled. Hayes tightened his grip on the cuffs as he escorted him through the station doors. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow across the tiled floors. A few officers glanced up from their desks, curiosity flickering in their expressions. "What've we got?" one of them asked casually. "Non-compliant. Obstruction," Hayes replied confidently, removing his cap and setting it on the booking counter. His tone was firm, rehearsed. He had already constructed the narrative in his mind. The booking process began. Name, identification, personal details. The man provided each answer clearly, calmly, without hesitation. There was no attempt to argue or resist. His voice remained steady, almost clinical. The officer handling the paperwork paused briefly, glancing at the information on the ID before typing it into the system. Something about the man's demeanor didn't match the charge being presented. Hayes noticed the glance. "He was resisting," he added sharply, reinforcing his version of events. The man finally spoke, his tone respectful but firm. "Officer, I have fully cooperated from the beginning." The room grew quiet for a moment. Hayes felt the subtle shift in atmosphere. He brushed it off and stepped aside as the cuffs were removed for fingerprinting. Even without restraints, the man stood motionless, disciplined, as if he were the one observing the officers rather than the other way around. After the booking was completed, Hayes walked into a smaller office to begin his report. He typed quickly, detailing the traffic violation, the supposed resistance, and the need for arrest. Every sentence was crafted to protect his authority. He omitted the shove. He softened the language around physical force. He framed the narrative as necessary and procedural, but as he typed, a faint unease lingered. The man's composure replayed in his mind the steady eyes, the deliberate movements, the absence of fear. Most civilians, when arrested, showed frustration or panic. This man had shown neither. In the holding area, the civilian sat quietly on the bench, hands resting loosely on his knees. He closed his eyes briefly, not in despair, but in focus. Behind the calm exterior, he was calculating. Every word spoken, every action taken, had been recorded. He knew the process. He understood the system. Back in the office, Hayes finished the report and leaned back in his chair. The paperwork made everything look official, justified. On the surface, it was just another arrest at the end of a long shift. But beneath that routine facade, something felt unsettled. Behind closed doors, away from the street and the crowd, the true consequences of the encounter were quietly taking shape. Hayes believed he had secured control within the safe walls of the station. He didn't realize that those same walls would soon echo with questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Morning light filtered through the narrow windows of the holding area, replacing the artificial glare of the night before. The station had returned to its usual rhythm, phones ringing, officers exchanging brief conversations, paperwork stacking up on desks. To most, it was just another day. But for Officer Hayes and the man he had arrested, the next steps were already unfolding beneath the surface. Hayes arrived early, coffee in hand, determined to finalize the case before his shift officially began. He reviewed his report carefully, scanning for inconsistencies. The language was firm and procedural. Subject displayed non-compliant behavior. Escalation required for officer safety. Each sentence reinforced his authority. On paper, the arrest looked justified. Clean. Routine. He convinced himself that once the hearing date was set, the process would move forward without issue. A minor charge. A quick appearance before a judge. Perhaps a fine or probation. Nothing that would come back to haunt him. That was how the system worked: efficient, predictable, supportive of its own. Across the station, the man sat calmly at a metal table, now dressed in neatly pressed civilian clothes, returned to him after booking. He had made a phone call earlier, short and direct. No raised voice. No urgency. Just precise information delivered to the right person. His composure unsettled the desk officer who had supervised the call. When Hayes passed by, their eyes met briefly. There was no hostility in the man's expression. No visible anger. Only focus. It was the kind of focus that suggested preparation rather than fear. By midday, word circulated that the man had secured legal representation unusually fast. Not a public defender, not a rushed appointment. A private attorney with a reputation for meticulous courtroom strategy. Hayes brushed it off at first, telling himself it didn't matter. Anyone could hire a lawyer. That didn't change the facts, at least not the ones he had written down. But as he overheard quiet whispers among colleagues' questions about the unusual calm of the arrestee, the quick legal response, Hayes felt that flicker of doubt return. He had encountered difficult civilians before, even defiant ones, but this was different. There had been no emotional reaction, no heated argument, only deliberate patience. The man, meanwhile, reviewed events methodically in his mind. Every moment on the street, every word spoken, every physical gesture. He knew what had been captured and what would be presented when the time came. He wasn't preparing for a simple defense. He was preparing for exposure. A preliminary court date was scheduled for later that week. Hayes noted it on his calendar, confident in his testimony. He had given statements countless times before. Judges trusted officers. Reports carried weight. He believed his version would stand uncontested. Yet, as he organized his uniform and badge that afternoon, he couldn't shake the sense that something larger was forming beyond his view. The calm man he had arrested was not scrambling to avoid consequences. He was waiting, and waiting, Hayes would soon discover, was far more dangerous than resistance. The courtroom was quieter than Hayes expected. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows of wooden benches where a small audience had gathered. The air carried that familiar mix of polish and tension, a place where narratives were tested and authority was no longer unquestioned. Officer Hayes adjusted his tie as he entered, his uniform pressed sharply, badge gleaming under the overhead lights. He reminded himself that this was routine. He had testified before. Judges respected officers who were confident and direct. Across the room, the man he had arrested sat beside his attorney, posture straight, expression unreadable. He wore a tailored dark suit, calm and composed, as if attending a professional meeting rather than a criminal hearing. Hayes noticed it again, that composure. No nervous glances, no whispered panic, just quiet observation. The proceedings began with formalities. The judge reviewed the charges: obstruction, failure to comply, resisting lawful orders. Hayes listened as the words were read aloud. They sounded solid in that setting, official and structured. When it was his turn, he stepped forward to testify. He described the traffic stop with measured authority. He spoke of suspicious behavior, non-compliance, and the need to ensure officer safety. His voice was steady, practiced. He avoided emotional language, sticking to the framework he had carefully constructed in his report. From his perspective, it was airtight. The defense attorney listened without interruption, taking occasional notes. The man beside him remained still, eyes forward. Hayes interpreted the silence as submission. Then, cross-examination began. "Officer Hayes," the attorney said calmly, "did the defendant at any point physically threaten you?" Hayes hesitated for half a second. "No direct threat, but so he did not strike you, attempt to flee, or verbally threaten harm?" "No," Hayes replied, feeling the subtle narrowing of the questions. "And yet, you stated in your report that force was necessary due to escalating resistance." Hayes straightened. "Based on my professional judgment, yes." The courtroom felt warmer. The attorney paced slowly, controlled. Professional judgment. Of course. And were there witnesses present during this traffic stop? Yes. Multiple witnesses? Yes. A pause followed, calculated, deliberate. The attorney exchanged a brief glance with his client. Hayes felt the shift in energy. The calm man in the suit finally looked toward him, their eyes locking for a fleeting second. There was no hostility, only certainty. The judge leaned forward slightly as the questioning continued. Each inquiry chipped subtly at Hayes's narrative, exposing small inconsistencies in wording, slight exaggerations in tone. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to plant doubt. The tension in the room thickened. Hayes maintained composure, but the confidence he had carried into the courtroom began to feel less solid. The defense wasn't attacking aggressively. They were dismantling patiently. As the cross-examination paused, the attorney requested permission to present supplementary evidence at the next phase of proceedings. The judge agreed. Hayes returned to his seat, telling himself it was standard procedure. Routine defense strategy. Nothing more. But as he glanced once more at the man beside the attorney, he sensed something deeper unfolding. The calmness was no longer just composure, it was anticipation. The courtroom, once a place Hayes believed favored him, now felt like unfamiliar ground. And whatever evidence was waiting to be presented, it was clear this case was far from routine. The courtroom felt heavier when proceedings resumed that afternoon. A quiet anticipation lingered in the air, as if everyone sensed something significant was about to unfold. Officer Hayes sat upright, hands clasped tightly in front of him, maintaining the outward image of composure. He reminded himself that he had followed protocol, that his report was solid, that the system would hold. Across the aisle, the defense attorney stood and requested permission to present video evidence. The judge nodded. A monitor was wheeled into view, positioned so the court could see clearly. Hayes's stomach tightened slightly, though he couldn't explain why. Body camera footage was common. Civilian recordings weren't unusual either. He had handled those situations before. The screen flickered to life. The footage began at the initial stop-clear audio. Sharp visuals. Hayes watched himself approach the vehicle. His tone, sharper than he remembered, echoed through the speakers. Each command sounded more aggressive when replayed in the silence of the courtroom. The shove, brief but unmistakable, played in full view. The murmurs from bystanders were audible. The repeated calm responses from the man he had arrested were undeniable. Hayes felt the room shift. The narrative he had constructed in his report began to unravel frame by frame. The non-compliance he had described looked more like steady cooperation. The escalation for safety appeared unnecessary, even excessive. When the footage ended, the courtroom was silent. The defense attorney stepped forward again, voice steady. "Your Honor, the defendant did not resist. He did not threaten. He complied at every stage. Furthermore," he paused deliberately, allowing the weight of his next words to settle. The defendant was acting in an official capacity. A ripple of confusion moved through the benches. Hayes' brow furrowed. The attorney turned toward his client. "Mr. Carter, would you please clarify your position for the court?" The man stood slowly, straightening his jacket. His posture was firm, confident, not defensive, but authoritative. When he spoke, his tone carried a quiet strength that filled the room. "My name is Special Agent Marcus Carter. I am assigned to an ongoing federal investigation into departmental misconduct." The words struck like a thunderclap. Hayes felt the blood drain from his face. The room erupted in whispers. The judge leaned forward sharply, eyes fixed on Carter. The attorney continued, presenting official identification and documentation, federal credentials, assignment records, verification from supervisory authorities. Each piece was methodically laid out, undeniable. Hayes' mind raced. Special agent, federal investigation, the calmness, the precision. It all aligned in an instant. He hadn't been dealing with an ordinary civilian. He had been confronting someone trained, someone prepared, someone documenting with purpose. The judge's expression hardened as she reviewed the credentials. The courtroom, once merely tense, now felt electrified. Hayes's confidence shattered under the weight of realization. His report, his testimony, every word now stood in direct contradiction to federal evidence and recorded proof. Special Agent Carter remained composed, eyes steady, posture unshaken. There was no triumph in his expression, no visible satisfaction, only professionalism. The balance of power had shifted completely. What Hayes had viewed as a routine assertion of authority had become public exposure, and in a matter of moments, the officer who believed himself untouchable was now the one under scrutiny. The silence that followed the revelation did not last long. What began as a low murmur quickly swelled into open shock. The courtroom, once orderly and predictable, now buzzed with disbelief. Officer Hayes sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table, as if anchoring himself to reality. Special Agent Marcus Carter stood calmly beside his attorney, his posture unchanged, as though the explosion of tension around him had nothing to do with him at all. The judge struck the gavel sharply. "Order," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. But even as the room quieted, the shift was undeniable. The dynamic had flipped completely. Hayes was no longer the confident authority presenting his version of events. He was the subject of scrutiny. The defense attorney resumed, voice steady and precise. "Your Honor, this was not a random stop. Agent Carter was operating within the scope of a federal inquiry, examining patterns of excessive force and misconduct. The interaction in question was recorded as part of that broader effort." The words landed heavily. Broader effort. Patterns. Misconduct. Hayes' thoughts raced uncontrollably. A federal inquiry? Patterns suggested this was not isolated. His chest tightened. He glanced toward the gallery and noticed two individuals he hadn't paid attention to earlier, men, in suits, composed, observant. Their attention was fixed on him. Not judgmental, not emotional, just clinical. The prosecutor, who had initially appeared relaxed about the minor charges, now seemed unsettled. Papers shuffled nervously at the prosecution table. The simple narrative of obstruction and non-compliance had collapsed. What remained was a detailed video record contradicting Hayes's testimony and the revelation that his conduct had been witnessed by federal authorities. "Officer Hayes," the judge said carefully, "were you aware that the individual you arrested was acting in a federal capacity?" "No, Your Honor," Hayes replied, his voice noticeably less steady than before. "Regardless," she continued, "the footage raises serious concerns about your use of force and your report's accuracy." The word accuracy echoed in Hayes' mind. His carefully constructed statements now felt like fragile glass under a spotlight. Every exaggeration, every omission, exposed. Agent Carter finally spoke again, measured and professional. "Your Honor, my role was not to provoke, but to observe and document interactions. The goal is accountability and transparency. No anger, no accusation, just clarity." That composure made the moment even heavier. Hayes felt heat creeping up his neck. He had believed the badge insulated him, that the uniform granted him unquestioned credibility. Now, surrounded by federal documentation and undeniable footage, that belief was unraveling. The judge called for a brief recess to review the submitted credentials and evidence. As the gavel struck again, signaling pause, the courtroom erupted into hushed but intense conversation. Hayes remained seated, staring at the polished wood floor. The chaos wasn't loud in his ears, it was internal. His career, his reputation, the possibility of disciplinary action, suspension, even charges, all of it loomed suddenly, sharply. Across the room, Agent Carter spoke quietly with his attorney, composed as ever. The storm Hayes had unleashed on a quiet street days earlier had now grown beyond his control, and for the first time he understood that this chaos would not simply fade away when the hearing ended. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere had changed permanently. The earlier tension had matured into something heavier consequence. The judge's expression was firm, measured, no longer neutral. Officer Hayes sat straighter than before, but the confidence he once carried had drained from his posture. After reviewing the evidence presented, the judge began. This court finds no basis for the charges brought against Mr. Carter. The words were direct, final. The obstruction charge was dismissed. The allegation of non-compliance collapsed under the weight of video proof. Hayes felt each sentence like a steady dismantling of the authority he had relied upon. But the judge was not finished. Furthermore, she continued, the footage and testimony raised serious concerns regarding Officer Hayes' conduct, use of force, and the accuracy of his written report. This matter will be referred to Internal Affairs for immediate review. A quiet ripple passed through the courtroom. Internal Affairs. The phrase alone carried weight within any department. It meant scrutiny not from civilians or defense attorneys, but from within the force itself. Hayes's throat tightened. He had seen other officers face reviews before. Some returned quietly to duty. Others did not. The badge that once felt like protection now felt fragile. Across the aisle, Special Agent Carter remained composed. There was no visible celebration, no smirk of victory. He simply nodded once to his attorney as the dismissal was finalized. His role had never been personal revenge. It had been documentation. Accountability. As proceedings ended, Hayes rose slowly from his seat. The prosecutor avoided eye contact. A court officer stepped closer, speaking quietly but firmly. You'll be contacted regarding the review process. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with subdued conversation. A few reporters, tipped off by the federal angle, waited near the exit. Cameras weren't yet flashing wildly, but attention was building. Hayes felt the shift immediately. He was no longer the officer bringing a suspect to court. He was the officer leaving under a cloud of investigation. His phone vibrated in his pocket, an email notification from his department. Administrative leave pending review. The words were short, procedural, but devastating. He had believed the system would shield him. Instead, it was moving swiftly to examine him. Agent Carter exited through a separate doorway, flanked briefly by two federal colleagues. His expression remained steady, professional. To him, this was one case within a larger effort. The objective had never been spectacle. It had been proof. Hayes stood alone for a moment in the hallway, staring at the polished floor. The memory of the traffic stop replayed in fragments. The shove, the raised voice, the dismissive tone. At the time, it had felt routine, controlled, justified. Now it looked different through the lens of consequence. Accountability had arrived quietly but decisively. The badge still rested on his chest, but its weight had changed. It no longer symbolized unquestioned authority. It symbolized responsibility, one he had failed to uphold. And as the reality of investigation and potential discipline settled over him, Hayes understood something he had ignored before. Power without restraint always demands a reckoning. Weeks passed before the final outcome was delivered, but the damage to Officer Hayes's career had already begun. Administrative leave turned into formal disciplinary hearings. Internal Affairs reviewed not only the footage from the traffic stop, but also prior complaints that had once been dismissed as minor or unsubstantiated. Patterns began to surface: aggressive conduct, exaggerated reports, unnecessary escalation. What Hayes had long considered routine enforcement now appeared as a troubling trend. The final decision came in a closed departmental hearing room rather than a public courtroom. Hayes sat across from a review panel, uniform replaced by a plain suit. The badge he once wore with pride rested inside an envelope on the table. The findings were clear. excessive use of force, falsification of official documentation, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. Termination was immediate. The case file would also be forwarded for further legal consideration. The announcement was short, procedural, devoid of emotion. But for Hayes, it marked the collapse of a career built on authority. As he left the building for the last time, he avoided eye contact with former colleagues. The patrol cars in the parking lot no longer felt like symbols of brotherhood. They felt like reminders of what he had lost. Across town, Special Agent Marcus Carter completed his own report. The investigation into departmental misconduct continued, broader than a single officer, deeper than a single traffic stop. Hayes's case became part of a documented record evidence supporting reform measures and stricter oversight. Carter never spoke publicly about the incident beyond official statements. When briefly approached by media outside the courthouse days earlier, he had responded simply, "Accountability strengthens institutions. Transparency protects communities." Nothing more. For the community, the case carried weight. Word spread quickly. The footage circulated, sparking conversations about responsibility, oversight, and trust. Some expressed anger, others expressed relief, but most agreed on one thing the evidence had spoken clearly. Justice, in this case, did not arrive with dramatic speeches or emotional confrontations. It arrived methodically through documentation, process, and review. The same system Hayes had trusted to protect him had ultimately demanded integrity from him. On a quiet evening, Carter drove through the same street where the traffic stop had occurred. There were no flashing lights now, no crowd, just ordinary life continuing. He paused briefly at the intersection, reflecting not on victory, but on purpose. The goal had never been humiliation. It had been balance. Power, when exercised without accountability, erodes trust. But when confronted with truth, it can be corrected. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement, the street looked ordinary again. Yet what had happened there left a lasting mark. An officer who believed himself untouchable had faced consequence. A system that often moved slowly had responded with precision. Justice had not been loud. It had not been chaotic. It had been deliberate, and in that deliberation, the balance between authority and responsibility had been restored.